I'll take the questions in reverse order, if that's okay. This issue of blaming people for their, what they do in their daily lives. I think it's easier for governments to say, to people, oh, you should turn off the lights or you should eat less meat or whatever, than it is for governments to take on the big vested interests, the big businesses that are responsible for a large part of the problem. So, if a big company comes along to a government and says, we want to build a new coal-fired power station, it's very difficult for the government to say no. It's much easier to say, oh well, this is a problem that the population must solve, that individuals must solve. So it's really important that as journalists we hold governments to account on that. That we point out the fact that that governments are not taking on the responsibilities that they have to regulate industry, which is the main source of greenhouse gas emissions in every country around the world practically. Industry or economic activities of some kind, i.e. not sort of personal stuff. So when I say industry, I mean what people do to make a living. So we've got to be aware of that, and we've got to hold governments to account on that. On the other hand, though, I think it's an important point that people should feel that they have the power to solve this problem, at least in part. And it's good for people to feel that there are actions that they can take in their everyday lives that will improve things. It's very depressing for people if you go around sort of turning off the lights or driving a more efficient car or using public transport or whatever, and then you feel as if your contribution doesn't add up to much. It's important for people to feel that, if we all make a contribution by leading a better lifestyle, then that does add up to a lot, and it's important for people to feel that they can participate, and particularly children. If you look at sort of children in schools, children get very keen on doing these things, recycling, or trying to help their parents to be greener and so on. So I think we shouldn't forget that. On the question of the models in newsrooms in England, I'm sorry to say that we have very much the same kind of model, and that everything does tend to be compartmentalised. Everything is in a little section, and reporters have their beats, and things are seen as the lines between different issues are kind of seen as quite rigid. But I do think that is changing for the issue of climate change, because climate change is an issue that crosses a lot of these boundaries. It's an issue for businesses, it's an issue for economics, it's an issue of politics, it's an issue, as I was saying earlier, of national security. It's it's something that crosses a lot of disciplines. And it's very important for me as an environmental journalist to be generous with my colleagues, so that other people in the FT can write about sort of climate change issues, with regards to their subject or their area. For instance, we have correspondents around the world, and a lot of those correspondents will write stories about climate change in their country, so that brings the issue onto the pages in a different way. We have correspondents who deal with particular industries, and they write about climate change with regard to their industries. To give you an example, our automobile industry correspondent writes about companies trying to make their cars greener, to look into hydrogen cars or electric cars and so on. Our aerospace airlines correspondent he writes about how airlines are worried about emissions trading and how their emissions will be capped. So it is an issue that if you look at it in the right way, there is not a single reporter really on any newspaper probably that could not write about climate change with regard to their specialist subject, and actually for an environmental reporter that's a really good thing, because then when the news editors see climate change coming up, being mentioned in stories from the airlines correspondent, the transport correspondent, the health correspondent, because climate change is a health issue as well. Then the news editor, it gets used to seeing stories about climate change. It becomes a mainstream issue, and then it's easier for me to get my stories in the paper because the news editor thinks, climate change, yes, we need to write about that. So you've got to sort of present these things in the right way. Finally, on the issue of the lady from the embassy, looking at the sort of citizenship and how citizenship can make a difference. I think this is a very important issue. I mean, recently in the UK, the Climate Change Minister, Ed Miliband, he made some remarks about how we should make actions that are not green, such as, for instance, driving a very big inefficient car, or not turning off the lights or whatever. We should make them socially unacceptable. In the same way that there was a big campaign, a big public health campaign many years ago in the UK about drink driving. And the way that worked was to make it socially unacceptable for people to get in a car if they had been drinking, to drive a car if they had been drinking. And that was very, very successful. And what he was saying we needed is something similar, so that it becomes socially unacceptable, it becomes embarrassing for people if they do things that are, environmentally unfriendly. The other thing I would say is that in Europe, across Europe, not so much in the UK, but in other countries in Europe, for instance Germany, for instance the Scandinavian countries, there are very strong green parties, parties that are just dedicated to, see the world through an environmental lens. And one of the ways in which those green parties in those countries are very influential. I mean, in some cases, they form coalition governments. In Germany, there was a Green Party, Socialist Party coalition government for a long time until very recently. And so, at a political level, Green parties can, if they get widespread support from voters, from the public, then they can wield an awful lot of influence. One of the ways, particularly looking at Germany, one of the reasons why the Green Party was so successful in Germany is because they had an incredibly charismatic, visionary leader, a politician called Joschka Fischer. And he had an enormous personal following. He was very well liked by the German public. And he sort of took the Green Party into government, to become a governing party. And so perhaps what we need in other countries is the same kind of thing. We need some visionary political leaders who can really push this forward. Thank you.